first off, what is Martech and adtech? Talk about that a little bit. And how do you maintain kind of the key value proposition of TV from an advertiser's perspective? And this is at maybe a little bit theoretical, so if it gets too theoretical, please raise a hand and tell me to be more concrete. But it's a little bit theoretical in the sense of the value proposition of TV historically has been scale and reach, and as other people have mentioned, super easy to buy. You want to spend a lot of money and reach a lot of people very quickly. TV is incredibly efficient. On the other hand, digital is not so efficient at that. But the opportunity for the combination of those two things is to kind of look at how do these things to interact. What can we provide? How can you duplicate that? How can you marry the best attributes of traditionally what TV is in terms of a product that's being sold? And what are the challenges that are faced in the process of doing that? So for the purposes of my presentation, Martech is the automation of the decision process. It's data-driven online marketing. And I think the talk yesterday gave a good example. It's using CRM as your DMP. You do not want to be given up to your agencies, to the ecosystem in general, your proprietary data, your understanding of your users, your understanding of the infrastructure. If you do, you want to do so consciously. You want to work with a partner that understands that. That's fine. But it's the automation and orchestration of your marketing efforts at a universal level. That's commonly seen now in B2B marketers. So that's part of the attraction of companies like Salesforce, Adobe, Oracle. I also run our B2B projects inside of IPONWeb. and B2B is a very different beast in terms of sales process, in terms of understanding, in terms of how the advertiser and the marketer is going to connect with someone for a considered purchase over a long period of time, renewal of subscriptions, things like that. And so it's a much more orchestrated and data-driven process. And if I were to characterize kind of Martech versus traditional kind of how advertising is talked about, it's much more taking the data and the data is telling you what's going on rather than you trying to impose your worldview and then have that got in personas and plans. It's like, this is actually what's happening, this is the information we're capturing, and this is what we're going to do to act on it. It's considered across all media types. If you look at enterprise sales and you look at some of the higher-end consumer brands, they don't distinguish. They're on taxi cabs, they're in display, they're in mobile. It's not about a channel, it's not about specific execution strategies, it's about meeting the marketing goals and getting some kind of ROI for each advertising dollar spent. So return on ad spend. So one example that might be a little more concrete is if you look at how Amazon goes out and provides marketing services for their affiliate customers. So if you have a product you want to sell on Amazon and have an Amazon store, and this is all just looking at it, Amazon's not super chatty about how they do things. They offer this as a service to their advertisers. So they will offer everything from product suggestions, they understand all of the history of your customers, they understand the price points that you are at other competitive things, they understand the customer journey as it applies to each individual customer. It's not some generalized thing, it's driven by massive amounts of data that tell you what's going on. They provide that insight, if you will, in terms of an actionable plan for their advertisers. The advertiser then gets fulfillment through things. They do retargeting, remarketing, sales, delivery, fulfillment. So it's a complete closed loop ecosystem that the advertiser gains the overall experience of their platform and their understanding. So it can be very small, very niche advertisers. You get a lot of insights, you get a lot of things, and you get someone who delivers it effectively as a service. So Martech is providing that kind of capability, generally speaking, to B2B customers at this point, but increasingly companies like Machine Zone and others build their own things where you're driving off of behavior and you're driving your media plan from that. So the machine learning part of that basically allows you to reach the right audience because you understand what the data is telling you is the right audience, not some theoretical right audience. You're able to reach them at the right point in the journey because you're looking across all of the touch points, you're looking across video, you're looking across mobile, you're looking across display, and you get the right message to them. You can do creative decisions. You can look at how they respond to these ads. You actually have the data to go forward. So these are incredibly machine learning driven systems. People would maybe argue that that's not as good as people, but at the scale and frequency and the different opportunities, I would say it's pretty hard to show that people can do that at a scale that will continue as things become more and more fragmented. So to get to the desired audience, you have these known users that are coming through your CRM system. And the targeting is based on that. It's based on things like lookalike models. It's based on predictive models of understanding where they're going next in the journey that's relevant to them. And it's to get the desired audience at the right time, like I said. A DMP tends to be a proxy for that, right? A DMP is effectively, and I'll talk a little bit more about it from the ad tech side of things, another distinction between ad tech and Martech is that Martech can be thought of as when you know who your users are, and ad tech is when you have kind of this anonymous mass of people, browsers, devices that you're trying to understand based on their behavior, whereas Martech is coming from the perspective of, I understand what I want, I'm looking for that now. The other one's like, okay, I understand who these people are, I'm trying to guess what they do next. So the DMP is effectively a proxy for the audience. More companies are now working in things like lookalike models, and certainly Facebook offers that, where you can do audience extension. Some of the publishers are offering a similar thing where they have a good understanding of people who consume certain types of content. And again, that looks like an audience extension type of a product. So full stack walled gardens are an example of that, where you have people who understand the whole thing. Doesn't matter what the parts are necessarily, but you can bring in outside data, you can bring in data gained from the sites that are operated by the walled garden, if you will, data gained from insights operated by other partners that are allowing you to pixel that information. You can manage the channels, you can manage the different assets. I was speaking to a gentleman the other day about e-commerce in Asia, and what Google has done there, and this guy was in a finance business. Google will go in there and basically finance receivables for successful small-scale e-commerce companies in Asia because they have cash flow problems. Google's able to take over part of the shopping cart experience. Now, better understand their audience. They can do factoring on the receivables for a pretty reasonable rate compared to the local banks. And now they take over the entire ecosystem, not just the advertising, but the full customer journey. So these things are starting to happen. They're, like I said, everybody's favorite whipping boys of Google and Facebook, but they're really good at it. And my argument, particularly for digital publishers, is that they happily give up these audience assets to other companies to monetize. So ad tech, and many of you probably are maybe more familiar with ad tech since this tends to be more of an advertising focused thing. It's, like I said, it's based on cookies, it's based on devices, there's the move towards people, but the understanding of people still is limited because it's people in the wild versus people as they apply to your specific advertising goals. It allows programmatic buys, so you're able to use the RTB ecosystem, and this gets confusing because RTB, yes, RT is real time, but it's about the pipes and connections and the data overlays and the pixels and the audience matching that provides rather than necessarily the real-time aspect of it. Lets you do an audience buys, and it's allowing you increasingly to do what would be considered a brand buy or more of a reach-based buy. And so there's plenty of examples. I think everybody's heard of supply players and demand players on that side. So in this case, machine learning is used, but it's also used in a very different way. Like I said, it's an anonymous activity. You're dealing with people, you're trying to guess what they do. You don't necessarily know who they are. Obviously, there's an advantage if you do know, but you're looking at them in a limited context, trying to meet limited campaign goals. You want someone to click. You want someone to engage with your content. So you make a decision right now, is this person likely to do this other thing or this other thing or this other thing? And for each of those outcomes, what am I willing to pay? So I optimize my bid based on that. And then maybe I can optimize my creative. What's the thing that they're going to most be responsive to? But it's still not the complete picture. So if you look from how do you start making this data actionable? You want to understand things, but understanding doesn't. I mean, it's nice, and I'm happy to talk about understanding all day, but it doesn't necessarily drive to an outcome that's interesting. So you want to drive to actionable insights that are going to deliver a return on ad spend. You want to be able to do this at scale. You want to be able to predict what's going to happen next. You want to be able to do that with some degree of certainty and then balance your budget against that. So these are some of the things that the Martech stacks are starting to go. And it's not just one source of inventory. There's quite a bit, though still relatively limited, research and studies by companies like Netflix and others who do incremental reach studies and will tell you, what's the effective impact of what you're doing. If you are only looking at an ad tech stack that says, look, you can see this person and maybe you know that they saw a search ad and maybe you know that they saw video, but you don't really have a full understanding, it's much harder to understand where does your media investment make sense at that point in time. So if you can consider all of the sources and all of the interaction across the spectrum of available media and against the goals that are important for that particular advertiser at that particular time for that particular opportunity, then you can make much more efficient and informed decisions. So you have to consider kind of the whole ecosystem and then not look backwards, not look at attribution and figure out what happened. You want to figure out what is going to happen and what's the likelihood of that happening. And so if you can shift to a predictive model versus a reactive model, it's much more actionable. So what's the difference in the kinds of solutions? And this is somewhat of a summary of what we've talked about, or I've talked about. So Martech, there's a full picture of what's going on. Yes, the current state of things are certainly idealized, but it's a constantly evolving model of what does the data tell us? What are the profiles of the people we look like, that we are looking for look like? What are the unique audiences that we see out there? How do we understand those? What journey does each of those customers take across each of the product lines, across each of the brands that we represent? Whereas ad tech has some slice of intent, can be very, very efficient. If you look at what a CPA can be done and driven down to for someone who really understands where their audience lives, it can be fractions of what it would be otherwise. So you don't have to do this broad spray of hopefully fine stuff. You're able to go after very, very specific audiences and to be very effective. But again, it's only a tiny slice of things. You don't really understand the goals and objectives in an ad tech solution, whereas Martech doesn't necessarily have the tactics, but it has the overall strategy. So if you look at the differences from kind of a non-ad tech language, you can compare it to learning a language. And so I know a little bit of Spanish, not so much. But the process of learning is very, let's say, holistic, right? So I can be very tactical. I can come someplace new. I travel a little bit. So I can go someplace new and I want to know how to get the bill. I can use something like Google Translate and type in, I would like my bill, please. And these days it'll actually guess that I'm going to ask that, so it'll just tell me that. But nonetheless, I can type that in. It'll give me some very tactical information. It gets good over time. Many, many people ask it. It can tell your location. It can tell you're in a restaurant. It can tell you the local differences in dialect. It's pretty good, right? So very useful. And if you don't follow these things, Google Translate is built by people who don't speak the languages that they represent. It's entirely driven by examples in the wild, right? If you look at kind of the holistic understanding, you have a visual understanding of languages. You have some auditory. You hear the different accents. You hear how different people react. And you have just the experience of being in the world of a different language that gives you a much richer and more comprehensive understanding of things and nuance. So it's not equivalent, right? But it's useful. Machine learning in a tactical sense is very useful. And if you're never going back to that place, they speak this unique language. Okay, it's probably adequate. But if you want to have a full understanding of the culture and the situation and the circumstances and the ability to actually communicate, then you need to have a more full picture in terms of that. And additionally, there is machine learning these days being used for language learning in more comprehensive ways. Probably the best known example is Duolingo. So TV, let's maybe focus a little bit on what part of the topic here is, TV rise. So TV is becoming more digital, even if the delivery is linear. The delivery doesn't matter what the screens are, but the audience is fragmenting. And I would agree with the idea that, this is when I speak at these conferences and attend media conferences, it's like the least representative audience of what we're all trying to sell and understand, right? I don't watch any TV, right? I just don't watch TV. I watch things on my TV. My kids watch some things on TV, but nonetheless, there's this change in behavior that is, I would say, relatively inevitable. It's not that TV is going away, but it's no longer the central focus of how to reach the large audiences, and I don't think that that's super controversial. TV's value proposition, again, reach, scale, the context is good, high impact, super easy to buy. And I think from an advertising perspective, the biggest challenge, and if you look at the history of TV, at least in the US, the broadcasters were able to fend off the cable networks reasonably successfully for quite a while, because you had to go do a deal with everybody, and there used to be a lot more cable companies and a lot more local broadcasters, and it was really a pain in the butt to go out there and buy TV, right? Now those things are centralized through sales houses and different mechanisms and NCC and different things like that in different markets. So TV has made itself easy to buy and interact with. If you want to buy a digital campaign, like, good luck. You're going to need 20 people just to do the coordination to spend relatively small amounts of money. So I guess one of the central theses of what I'm looking at is thinking about things in terms of audience as a platform. And that from a Martech perspective, audience, there's an idealized audience of what your target customers look like that's coming from the bottom up. It's coming from the data, it's coming from your experience, it's coming from loyalty cards and point of sale systems and different touch points in reality that are important for that specific advertiser, if you will, in their currency that makes sense for them. And the CRM is where that information tends to live. There are then layers upon that. So there's analytics that provide insight, there's analytics that do audience extension or lookalike models. But from the advertiser perspective, this is a desired audience. From the supply side, it's better understanding that audience. And why do you care? Because if you're able to sell it, you're not able to sell it. Well, again, if you had the historic reach that you were the source of finding that audience, then it didn't really matter so much. But over the next couple of years, there are more and more obvious places to find the audience that's interesting to you. It isn't that people aren't watching TV, it's that those people can be found somewhere else. So it's somewhat analogous, I think, to the way that digital has changed for print publishers. It used to be you had to go to the print publisher because that's where the people went. But you don't have to. Those people are now exposed to media, basically from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed. And there's many, many, many touch points that those people can be found. And the better understanding that you have of the audience, the better understanding of how that relates to the principles that are interesting to you. So what does each advertiser want? And how does that compare to what you can provide? Not just the age and gender, but the schedule, nor the schedule, but the actual audience and their experience in the point in time. So it requires a different understanding. It requires the ability to adapt, not only in terms of kind of exposing that audience, but in terms of what is the value to them. Because if you understand the value as a supplier, you're better able to maintain your margins and to capture some media. So, just to my earlier point also, this is what the platforms are really good at. This is what Amazon is fantastically good at within their space. Google and Facebook are good at it. Others in different markets are really good at it. And they're looking at it as an audience-based buy. You're giving the audience to someone to monetize. So does it make sense? Maybe. Does it make sense to take some of that in-house or to partner with people that look at it differently and not just give it up as a free asset? If you think you're in the content business and you're advertising supported, well, you're not going to be in the content business for very long, because your product is the audience. Your product is not your creative content. The creative attracts the people, but you need to understand the people it attracts, because those people have a variety of interests in a variety of different things that are important to different advertisers in different ways. And new opportunities can be understood and capitalized if you have that understanding. If you don't, then you're at the mercy of the people who do have the understanding. So what are the opportunities? Basically, how do you create new and incremental revenue streams? So there's a few things. You can support different advertiser currencies. So you can understand the audience in terms the advertiser understands it better, closer. It's not perfect, but dealing directly with them to understand what can be of interest. Then you can build products specifically to that. And this has historically been something TV has done. In the US, there's the upfronts. And the upfronts basically sit down in front of the advertisers, and there's some understanding and negotiation between, these are the people we think are going to watch the show, these are the shows we're interested in investing in, because they're actually building out the investment from the advertisers. And so these products, it's just a different kind of product. And then unifying it, because it's not just the audience and understanding on linear or OTT or VOD or catch-up. It's having a unified view of the audience for the content that can be done. So there's different ways to support the advertisers. Importantly, it's not giving up your assets. So if you think your asset is a creative, yeah, it's an important asset, and you should have your intellectual property maintained. But if you're an ad-supported business, your audience is your asset. There was the saying, still is the saying, but it was more popular, which is if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So it's important to understand what the product is. If you think that, if you look what Netflix did to reruns, at least in the US, sorry for the overly local references, but it used to be, as a kid, I would watch Gilligan's Island and different shows like that after school from TV, and you just watch them on the regular TV. Now you can watch any of those old shows on any kind of streaming service. And you can go to Amazon, you can go to Netflix, you can go to plenty of places and see old shows. So that business is gone from the TV thing. So they gave up that content. The audience shifted. Now you have to maintain and build those audience assets and understand the value to the advertisers. And then incremental revenue. If you're able to understand the actual consumption of your media rather than the idealized version of consumption based on day parts, based on let's say broad demographic measures, you're able to get new advertisers that are interested in that would not have necessarily been associated with TV content, irrespective of how it's delivered, but including linear. And then having a unified offering. So not having 400 people monetizing your content. That just kind of destroys your ability to understand who's working with it, who your audience is, who your advertisers are. And the closer the offering, the minimal opportunities there are for fraud and, let's say, unnecessary arbitrage. So there's measurement and privacy concerns. So in Europe, I think an advantage that TV has is that it is not as personally identifiable. There is an understanding and ability to deal with, from the digital perspective, which largely exists in the broadcast perspective, but applies to the digital perspective. People don't like basically getting up their information for nothing, right? If there's informed consent, sure, you can get some information. But TV has that advantage of coming from, not necessarily by choice, but a more privacy-safe way. And you just need different ways to measure. So how do you deliver the audience, and kind of how does this all work? So programmatic channels, basically packaging into new audience products. You're able to do a plan based on audiences. You're able to execute and then measure what's going on, the message, the time, the audience. You update and feed back that into your model. So you can have a model for both the media owner, but also for the advertiser in the form of, in my example here, a Martech system. The Martech platform understands and continuously is doing this. This is not something that happens on quarterly reviews. This is something that happens kind of day by day, hour by hour, having a comprehensive understanding of what is the data telling us. And if you give up the data, well, you're going to have a hard time understanding and just be left with your best guess. So how do you move to these channels? So building audience understandings and outcomes, bridging the identity and audience, so having some bridge between the Martech actually knowing who this person is to what does that potential audience look like. You have to be able to plan and execute against this. It can't just be a theoretical thing. And moving towards performance. So it's an outcome. It's return on ad spend. It doesn't have to be that you're going to sell something. It doesn't have to be performance as is narrowly defined historically. But it's, can you measure what you're looking for? Hopefully it gets increasingly better. And if you look at the digital side of things, those have been, super optimized. TV not so optimized. They need to find a way to meet in the middle. So what are the challenges that we're going to face? So, I think the biggest thing, and then this is true for digital, it's not unique to TV at all, is, and it came up yesterday, what happens when you know something that you didn't really want to know? If everybody's happy getting along because it's good enough and they can go play golf and have martinis, once you start exposing that data, that's, let's say, structurally challenging to most organizations. It doesn't matter how you're being doing that. What's being driven by this is people are changing, the consumers are changing. So whether you like it or not, within 18 months, 24 months, massive amounts of the spend is going to shift. People are working on these problems. Companies like Google and Facebook, and we haven't even talked about China, All of this is like massively shifting to data-driven understanding of what's going on. So you may be able to maintain some walled gardens and you may be able to protect things in the traditional way, but many, many other people are basically navigating around the inertia that's in the existing ecosystem, and they will deliver the outcomes at a lower price, more effectively, more efficiently, and if you don't get on board, then it's going to be a challenging space. So you have people that are innovation, you have some early adopters, and you have the early majority. And I would argue, we're maybe between innovators and early adopters, but that the time period between early adopters and early majority of adapting these things, of moving substantial amounts of money, and more importantly, changing expectations. It isn't, I'm old enough to remember not that long ago, 15, 20 years ago, you did not just get on your phone and order a ticket and go to Europe, right? And I can plan and compare 16 different flights from LA to 12 different airports in Europe, and I can be there the next day. You had to go to the travel agent, and you had to wait, and you had to get quotes, and they had to call the rate desk. All of that is gone, right? You don't have to go to a bank teller for 90% of your bank transactions. These things are coming, and as soon as the expectation gets in place for the advertisers and the ease of use and all of those things, and people are building and actively investing in it, then it fundamentally changes. So at least having an understanding about how to approach this, understanding the value proposition, being able to adapt, being able to take the lessons learned from other industries and what has and hasn't worked, provides an opportunity to really get ahead of, if you will, programmatic systems. But it's much more fundamentally changing the way that we do business and delivering value, because I think in the end, it definitely rises, but it's not that it's not disruptive. So e-commerce, like I mentioned earlier, I think is probably the quickest way, probably the most disruptive to advertising, because there's lots and lots of advertising money spent in CPG or FMCG, depending on what you want to call it. And companies like Amazon and Walmart and Alibaba and others are basically, they know everything, right? They know what emails you send, they know when you go shopping, they know everything about you. And now they can just, not only can they sell you things, they can go have private label versions of those things made to sell them to you, right? So they don't even need the advertiser in the end, right? Because they have the consumer. So it's not just that advertising is being disrupted, the entire value chain is being disrupted. The customer doesn't care, right? If you get there, if you get your toilet paper, your dental floss, and it's the kind you want, and it's based on your actual experience and interest, and it's effectively personalized to you, who cares, right? I don't care what brand it is. I mean, there's a few people who maybe care in certain areas that are less subject to disruption, but these things are happening now. This is, Amazon's been doing this in the US for several years now. So anyway, as we bring these things together, there is an opportunity to start using this data to capture the data from the broadcasters and operator sides, use those resources and make it easier to do business with them, to capture and maintain the value proposition that TV brings in terms of the content and the adjacency and the context and the experience. But if people don't do it now, others are going to kind of take the lead. So that's it.